Hello, my name is Samuel Nono, and today I'll be discussing the best practices for sampling, especially when it comes to ensuring accuracy and validity in data collection. So, in this presentation based on sampling, I will define what sampling is, I'll talk about the importance of sampling, I'll mention the different sampling types, I'll ensure ways to choose effective sample types based on the research that you're carrying, and then I will also discuss the best practices for sampling. So let's begin with what sampling means. Sampling is essentially selecting a subset of individuals from a larger population to represent the whole. So you reflect a group of people based on the larger population that it is found in. This is typically essential for a bunch of different reasons, and we'll go through those reasons in this presentation. But essentially, in sampling, you do want the population that you are doing research on to be represented in an effective way, and so getting that subset is a great way to attend that need. Kind of like what I've mentioned earlier, sampling allows researchers to make inferences, so logical assumptions about populations. So getting a subgroup, a subset of a general population will save you time. It will also save you resources because you're not dealing with the entire population. So best practices in sampling ensure accuracy, which will essentially reduce bias. That's what you really want to ensure when you're sampling, making sure that you have an accurate representation of the population, but that you're also reducing bias when it comes to the representation of that population. So I did mention that there are two types of sampling. Um, the two types of probability and non-probability. So probability will be essentially the type of sampling that I've been defining so far. So with probability, individuals in the population have an equal chance of being selected, mainly through randomization. So it aims for a representative sample, which makes results more generalizable. From what you get from your sample group, you're able to make a more general deduction for your larger population. So in probability sampling, you'll have random sampling, stratified sampling, and systematic sampling. So just to touch base on each three of these, random sampling really deals with individuals in the population, and they all have an equal chance of being selected. So this method would help reduce bias, which is a good practice to have to ensure accuracy in sampling. Um, so it will make it ideal for studies requiring generalizable results. For instance, if you were to select 100 participants randomly from a list of all university students, you'd be able to get a good representation of the students found in those universities. Stratified sampling is slightly different. So in this scenario, the population is divided into subgroups based on shared characteristics like your age, your gender, or your income. And a random sample is still also in this case drawn from each subgroup to just again ensure accuracy and selection and the reduction of selection bias. It also ensures representation from all relevant groups, which can lead to a more accurate insight. For instance, if you were to survey 50 men and 50 women separately within a study on health behaviors, you would get more insights based on the people that you interview, and making these distinct understanding of those groups that you're studying on will give you will create more answers and insights on the fact that the answer that derived from those groups derived because of the demographic of those groups, if that makes sense. Systematic sampling now is slightly different, but still is a similar type of sampling because it is still under the umbrella of probability sampling. In systematic sampling, you have individuals that are selected at regular intervals from a list of the population. So, for instance, choosing every 10th person from an ordered list will make it more effective for a larger ordered population, though it can be prone to bias. It still has, if it has any hidden order. So if you were to select every fifth household in a neighborhood for a community survey, for instance, would be an example of systematic sampling. So it's kind of like having it in intervals, and selection is done through intervals. So those are the main ways that probability sampling is done. Now we will focus on non-probability sampling. So in non-probability sampling, individuals are chosen based on convenience, because we're looking for something a bit more particular and peculiar. So the selection is not as random as it would be in a probability sampling. In this case, the approach does not necessarily reflect the population because we are looking for something specific. So it's more useful for exploratory research. In non-probability sampling, you have three forms as well. So you will have convenience sampling, which is where samples are taken from a group that is easily accessible to the researcher, such as participants in a public space or students in a class. Um, while fast and cost effective, this method can be prone to selection bias, and it also does lack generalizability. Um, an example of this would be surveying individuals at a shopping mall about their spending habits. Another form of non-probability sampling would be purposive sampling. So this could also be known as judgmental sampling. This is where participants are chosen based on specific characteristics or knowledge that are relevant to their study. So the method is often used in qualitative research, where the researcher needs details, insights from a specific group, like interviewing expert doctors to understand recent trends in a medical field, for instance. And then you have your quota sampling. So this is where researcher divides the population into two different groups. So you have sets a quota for each group, and you'll have different categories for those groups. Unlike stratified sampling, which is a probability type of sampling, this does not require random selection as well, just like the two other forms of non-probability sampling. Um, this could also potentially introduce bias because of that, but this is also for a more specific type of research. So those are the two main types of sampling when it comes to having it in research: probability and non-probability. And when it comes to choosing the type of sampling that you want to implement in your research, um, it really has to do with if you want your group to reflect the population or if you have a deeper goal for your research topic. If your research topic depends on a specific demographic, then that could also influence the type of sampling that you are making. Alright, now I will touch quite quickly on the different types of practices that would be best for sampling. So the first one would be to define the population clearly. So when you're defining the population, you want to make sure that an accurate definition of the group that you want to study is made known and emphasized. It gives a clear distinction on what you're talking about and the people that you're talking about. This reduces errors in sampling, and it also improves research relevance. The second best practice that I will mention today would be the right type of sampling technique. So when you're considering your research, You want to make sure that you're selecting the sampling method that aligns best with your research. Going back to what I mentioned earlier, the probability versus non-probability. So, based on what you truly are researching, you want to make sure that the method that you're using is adequate to that, to guarantee effective conclusions and to draw something that can be more beneficial for the growth of the research topic that you are focusing on. And then there's also making sure that you calculate the sample size appropriately. So, an appropriate sample size will obviously secure the statistical power and validity of your research. So, the data that your research has, you want to make sure that you do that in an effective and accurate way. So, power analysis is a great way for that. Slovin's formula, which is a statistical method used to determine an appropriate sample size from a given population when the population size is known, but the variance of the population isn't. So this is a formula that you can use to calculate your sample size. However, a good tool to do that to make your life much easier would be a software like GPower for sample size calculation. Another best practice that you want to make sure that you have when you are conducting sampling in your research is the minimization of bias. It's hard to do that because subconsciously we tend to be biased, so this is something that you really have to make sure is done in an appropriate way, because even your understanding of what bias can be different and inaccurate. So in order to minimize that, because you can entirely eradicate it, it's subconscious to a certain degree. Two good ways of minimizing bias can be done when sampling. The first one would be selection bias, and the second one would be non-selection bias, non-response bias. Sorry. So selection bias occurs when certain groups within a population are systematically excluded or overrepresented in a sample, which leads to unrepresentative results, false results, for instance, because you're selecting the group that you're focusing on when it wasn't the intent of your research. You're doing it simply because of that bias. It ends up falsifying the result that you have. Non-response bias is another way to minimize bias in sampling. This happens when individuals are selected for a survey or study and do not respond, potentially skewing results um, from what was anticipated if non-respondents differ significantly from the respondents. Because now you make conclusions based on those who responded, but if those who responded aren't an accurate reflection of the total population, or at least the people that you interviewed, then that also gives misrepresentation in data. So those are the two ways you really want to make sure you minimize bias when it comes to sampling. And the final best practice here to ensure sampling is done effectively would be ethical considerations. So informed consent, which is essentially letting the individual know that they are taking part of the research and having them verbally consent to being a part of that research. Obviously, informed consent has to be an individual who's above the age of 18. So this is very important when it comes to sampling, because the people are your sample. They're the representation of your data. So if you don't have accurate consent, informed consent, this could essentially jeopardize the entirety of your data. So you want to make sure that informed consent is done appropriately. Another ethical consideration when sampling or used in sampling would be confidentiality and anonymity. 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 It's a hard word for me to say. This is when you protect your participants' privacy. A good law for that would be HIPAA. Um, although this can also be used in outside of just research. These are also good considerations that you want to incorporate when you're dealing with sampling. And the third ethical consideration in sampling would be fair representation. So you want to make sure that you're avoiding discrimination or exclusion based on demographics unless justified. Again, if you're specifically conducting research on why men tend to be more depressed, it would make sense to have your target population being men. However, if your research is supposed to be a reflection of your entire and general population and you simply interview men, then you're not accurately reflecting the entire population. So you want to make sure that you have a fair representation when dealing with sampling. So those are the three ethical considerations when it comes to sampling. So yes, essentially these are the best practices used when you want to ensure that sampling is done effectively. What I did discuss in this presentation today was the definition of what sampling is and defining your population based on the type of sampling that you're choosing to select, again, based on the research that you're conducting. I also mentioned how to calculate the sample size accurately, how to minimize your bias when it comes to sampling, because that's very important and you can completely eradicate it, so the best way is to minimize it. I also discussed the ethical guidelines as well, and always make sure to review sampling methods and to ensure ethical sampling for better quality research. Those practices can help you conduct sampling in a much more effective way